Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the next episode. And today we're going to be I'm going to share with you some of the experiences and the way life is for Muslim women in Britain, both in terms of the history and also now. So I think just to really think about the history really of Muslims in Britain, and I've spoken about this in a different episode in a bit more detail generally, but really focusing today on women. And I think it's just important for us to realise that Muslims have been in Britain for hundreds of years, actually. We've got many examples of the first mosque that was built in Britain in Surrey was built in the late 1800s. And it's an amazing place, and anybody who comes to Britain, I'd recommend that you go there. So there were some of the early kind of Muslims that converted and settled here. We had a big Yemeni Muslim community that settled in Liverpool and other areas. But the majority of Muslims came to Britain from Pakistan mainly, and it was in the 60s and then into the sort of 70s. And the common sort of story, of course every story is different, but the common story was that most of the Pakistani families, the man came first, found a job, and the communities were encouraged then to come here to help rebuild the country and to take on some of the labour jobs that were here. And in a lot of the common stories are that the man came first and then the woman, his wife, joined him maybe a year, 2 years later. So this is quite a common story for the first generation of Muslims that came to Britain. A lot of them came from not just Pakistan, but from the same area of Pakistan and settled here. And what happened was that because they needed something familiar and they wanted to live together, they actually settled into areas all in the same place. So very quickly, areas where there were a lot of factories or some of the mill towns in the north of the country attracted people in quite great numbers, because often you would find that a man had come, his wife had come here, their children were born here, but then other members of their family would also apply to come. And so you very quickly started to see Muslim communities developing in certain areas. Certainly near the main airports, for example, in Heathrow Airport, there are large areas around that area where Muslim communities settled, because again a lot of them were working at the airport, the men and the women came and the families developed in those areas. And of course the children then started to be born and were British, so as far as they were concerned they were born in this country, still had a connection with Pakistan, and of course their parents had those kind of direct links with their own families there, but more and more you would start to see that children were born here. I think in many ways, as in a lot of communities, women at that time became really the backbone of the community, so were really, really important part of it. And I think the reason for that was because the men generally were working and sort of labour type work, sometimes shift work where they're working at nights or working early in the mornings, and a lot of the kind of family, setting up the home, looking after the children, dealing with school, these kinds of issues about education, were largely taken on by the women in those days, and actually to a certain extent still are now. But of course in those days I think the women really became the people that often women do, which is to develop friendships, to make links with other families. Things like mosques were starting to be built in those early days of the Muslim communities settling here. A lot of the masajid were actually from houses that were converted and made into places that people could pray. And gradually you started to see the community build itself up. Things like halal meat, of course, weren't readily available, so the Muslim community then had to develop shops and businesses that would support the meat and also other things that people wanted to eat. Women became supporters for one another, so they were all in the same situation, which was that most of them couldn't maybe speak English, had to either learn or support one another in their own sort of home languages. They would need to find, Quran classes that were for the children to learn how to read the Quran, how to to develop those kind of support services amongst themselves, learning the language and trying to just really fit in to life and develop an understanding of the culture here. And I think generally speaking, if you speak to people from that first generation of people, so someone like my mother-in-law or other people her age, I think generally they would say the times were generally good, happy. Britain in the 70s did have racism, so people were subject to name calling and sometimes physical kind of violence as well. But that wasn't specifically targeted at Muslims, that was really targeted at somebody from a different colour. So there were issues between the sort of black and white here. Asians were seen as the other, and it was, you know, some people found that difficult. And obviously if you speak to people, I find it amazing that sometimes people kind of laugh that off. Even if I've spoken to my husband, he'll say he remembers being called this name or that name by people in the street. But it was kind of accepted that was how it was then. And obviously, thankfully, things have got a lot better now. But I think it was much more in those days for the early Muslim families, the men and the women. It was much more for them about surviving and developing jobs and earning money. And I think a lot of the families then really felt that they would actually go back. Women and men came here expecting it to be quite temporary, not something that would that they would be here forever. And then, of course, I think what happened was that the children were born. They started to establish a life here. Children grew up, started going to school. And over the next sort of 10 to 15 years, from the 60s through 70s to the 80s, you really felt that the children were absolutely saw themselves as British, didn't see themselves in any other way. Some of my friends who were sort of born second generation had never and still have not been to Pakistan even, which I find interesting. I've actually been to Pakistan twice. I think it's important people to keep that connection. But of course they felt British, this was home, and didn't ever really question that. Born here, went to school here, the culture was part of them, music, clothes, food, and that was all fine. I think people were kind of, the families, when you look back and when you ask about the stories, you'll find it was, you know, generally it was really quite a positive experience then. I think the families obviously grew. People had, you know, 3, 4, 5 children in some cases, and then the communities themselves kind of developed and grew. Obviously there were areas of the country where there was that tension, whether it be racism from the sort of, if you like, white British community who were not really used to different cultures, people from different backgrounds. And so that did create some tensions in some areas. And into the 90s, we did see a few incidents where communities kind of clashed. But it wasn't everywhere, and it certainly wasn't, you know, you could certainly not say that it was common. I think there were incidents and cases, and still now we see in places in Britain where actually Muslims, Pakistanis, but Muslims have actually isolated themselves and actually are keeping themselves all living in the same areas as each other, only really dealing with people from their own background. And I think that is divisive, and actually is not healthy for Muslims, for Pakistanis, for Muslims to do. There's always going to be a natural element of that where people feel comfortable with people from the same background who maybe have the same first or second language as them, eat similar food to them. But I think to do it too much and to not recognise it always when it is negative, I think does actually create some anxiety for people, and I think rightly so. Having said all of that, of course we have areas of the country, housing estates and populated areas which are all white, which don't have people from different backgrounds and are not very diverse at all. And often you'll find those places tend to be economically, people are struggling, and so that can sometimes cause tensions the other way as well. And so I think work that the kind of people like myself and others who try and do is to bring those groups of people together, always be looking for opportunities to bring people together. So I think then we have the so there are people, and women often we look at the statistics now and see that women in the sort of Pakistani communities and some of our other people from other Muslim communities of different backgrounds are economically the most inactive community in this country. They are suffering from more mental health issues than any other community. There's generational issues between the first and the second and third generations, and there's sort of like got issues there that aren't always resolved fully. The standard of living for some women, some Muslim families, is not that high, and so you can, you know, it's almost a joke that you sometimes go into an area and you know when you're driving through the Muslim part of the area because it's perhaps not as developed. And there's been all sorts of social studies and research on these issues, and it's not something that's simple. I just wanted to really sort of highlight that it's there. It's not simple, and people will say there is discrimination. Opportunities are not given to some people as much as they're given to others. So there are complications and issues, and you know, and we need to sort of recognise and be familiar with those, and be familiar with our history. But being able to also recognise the positive as well. So I think really for me it's about, you know, looking back at the way that people came, the way they settled, the fact that the women were absolutely part of that settlement process, and I think were really, really key to developing those communities and developing those relationships. And women are always very good at sort of making friends and linking that with the school, and with that came some of its own issues, the generational issues that I've mentioned, the sort of second generation in a way, and third, feeling that they're just not understood. But it was very much about the sort of Asian minority identity, rather than specifically thinking about being Muslim. And obviously with that sometimes comes a kind of clash really between, or mixture between, culture and religion. And this is an issue that I think young people especially feel that they face. How do they move their way through what is essentially a very strong culture of their parents and the rest of their family? At the same time, they're British, they're born here. How do they keep those things in check and actually feel comfortable? So things like the role of women, dress, these issues often come up at these times. How women are treated within the community, how they're not necessarily empowered. We have mosques, masajid here, which don't have space for women to pray. And so these issues clearly are not coming from the teachings of the faith. They're actually coming more from culture and how that impacts. And some of those issues are you know, get very blurry and very mixed up. So I think generally, just to sort of summarise that part of the sort of story really of Muslims, and especially women, and to say that they really came as a sort of almost thinking it would be temporary, and then eventually established and very quickly became part of this country. And the stories are very positive, and you hear lots of nice neighbour to neighbour kind of stories in those days. Although there was racism generally in this country in certain areas, and people did experience that and were the victims of that, but they also were developing really well and, you know, established. And I think we all now are very complimentary actually of that first community that came here, that faced those difficulties. Language was an issue, you know, finding themselves and settling, finding others of the same background. All of that was not something that happened easily, but they actually managed it and developed themselves and settled, I think, very, very well. And we always, it's very quick for us to kind of criticise some of the things they didn't do, but actually we need to be mindful of how they did manage. And especially, I always say, the women who kind of established and got the communities really, really organised and amongst themselves. So I think after the break, I'll talk more about this issue and maybe look at how, you know, the current situation with Muslim women and some of the good things and maybe some of the negative things. So I'll see you after the break, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the show. And before the break, I was talking about the Muslims, and specifically trying to focus on the Muslim women in Britain and maybe some of the history, and just briefly covering some of the main sort of stories that came out of those early experiences that Muslim women had in Britain. And I wanted now to just talk a bit more about how it is kind of now more into the 90s and the 2000s, and how things are now, and the sort of picture, just to give you really an idea of where things are at now. So in the late 90s and into the sort of early 2000s, the conversation's much more focusing on the Muslim aspect of people, rather than them just being part of the Asian community, because most of the Muslims that came initially were from Pakistan, and almost like a certain area more in the north of Pakistan as well. So it was quite a specific people and group, and they sort of were, it was really about settling and getting used to this country. And then the conversation started to change, and some of that would have been coming from the Muslims themselves. So you now had the sort of second generation of Muslims that were growing up. They became students, went to university here, and really developing a kind of finding their feet and their own identity, trying to challenge and push back on some of the things that maybe their parents were trying to teach them, which were sometimes they would see as mixed up with their culture more than the actual faith itself. And then, of course, in 2001, when the 9/11 happened in America, it actually had obviously internationally it was a big thing, a big issue, and it did have a really big direct impact in the UK on Muslims here. Condemnation in terms of the act itself from pretty much every Muslim in the UK, certainly the organisations and institutions all gave statements and talked about how they condemned it and how it wasn't part of Islam. And there was there was all of a sudden a spotlight on British Muslims in a way that we hadn't seen really before, and the conversations changed to become very political and much more focused on really negative things, and so it was quite difficult. I think it was quite a difficult time for Muslims to really. I mean, you talk to some people now, and Muslims will say that their identity was in question. They themselves thought about all of a sudden much more who they were, who they weren't, who they were, what it meant to them, what it means to live in Britain, and all of the sort of issues that came up because the reaction from the world, from people around us in Britain towards Muslims was very, very hostile, and actually changed quite significantly. Really, the whole world and the focus changed. People felt spied on and felt that it was very negative. It had a very negative impact on Muslims, and it was a real time for self-reflection. And obviously what happened was Muslims often went kind of backwards and went into their own sort of communities and felt that they couldn't really relate to others who weren't Muslim. And then, of course, we had our own bombings in the UK in July 2005, and again it was very negative, both for men and women Muslims. It was just generally very hard. I think for young people it was a time to really try and understand what on earth was happening. How did this happen? We saw stories upon stories of these men and how they were born here, brought up here, and what had gone wrong, and why did they suddenly decide to turn on their own people, essentially. And it raised a lot of question marks about that. And obviously the government then had to think about what their response would be. And there was some work that came out of that, and sort of national programmes that the government led on. Some were positive, many were not positive, and the community were then still trying to figure out how to respond to all of this. And obviously women, as always, will be absolutely part of that. And I think Muslim women have always then felt kind of caught then, because on the one hand, the sort of far-right parties in this country will often use Muslim women as the example of oppression and negativity that they will say Islam is really about, and that this is what the real story of Islam is, and look how they treat their women, and they'll show imagery. And we've seen protests and things in the street with placards, and it will have a picture of a Muslim woman in a niqab, or it will talk about it in a very, very negative way. And Muslim women become almost like a symbol of their way of explaining the far-right groups and others who are sort of have this anti-Muslim hatred really in them, will use Muslim women often. The image and the imagery of Muslim women is often used. And we then obviously, of course, amongst our own communities have issues as well. So Muslim women don't always feel that they're respected or that they're given their rights, and that they don't always feel that they're part of the community in the way that they should be. And it can be very hard. It can be very hard for older women, also for younger girls as well. So I think, issues around feeling sort of sidelined. We have some issues that need a lot more conversation and discussion in universities, and how some of the Muslim activities that happen there, how Muslim women are perceived or treated in some of those environments. The masajid here, majority of which don't have women's general involvement in the actual running of the place at all. People will often say that it's actually women who donate jewellery or donate money to build many of these places, and actually they're not even welcome to sometimes come in and pray. So this is a sad kind of situation. It's not everywhere, and there are many, many people that don't act in this way. but those that do, we need to look at it, recognise it, and think really carefully how we actually move things forward. I personally am an optimist, and I feel that there's more positive than negative, and always try to work with as many people as I can on these issues, but still we have to acknowledge that they're there. So right now in 2013, from a Muslim women's perspective, certainly I feel very happy to be a Muslim woman living in Britain, developing my skills and understanding, and being part of this country, and having children here and bringing them up here. And I feel comfortable with that. I feel empowered to do things that I need to do. Many people don't, and there's many issues within our communities, and many women who would never be able to sit and say that in a way that I have. And unfortunately, that is the case. But for those that do, I think we're seeing a community that's really maturing. Women and men, but specifically talking about women here, are pretty much in every profession you can think of, Muslim women, every sort of walk of life, you will see presence of Muslim women there. Much more professional, people running their own businesses, being very creative about how they earn money, or do voluntary work. Social action projects often are headed locally by women. We do have issues at the community level, and we also do have issues with leadership. So a lot of the leadership kind of positions, decision-making roles, are all men. And so we will have an event where it's a mixed event, so men and women, families, but all of the speakers from the stage will be men. I regularly question this issue, and have become known actually for somebody who actually questions this, because I just don't understand how that relates to my faith, and how that's the case. If a woman has something to offer and actually may have more knowledge on a topic or a subject than a man, then she should be invited to speak about it with men. I see no issue with that, and actually see it as a very positive thing. So in the relationships I have in some of my work, my voluntary work, community work, social action work, where men and women have managed to work together, it's the best example of how things can progress. And I actually do feel that some of the issues we have in our community, where I spoke earlier about lack of education of some of the Muslim women in our communities, or mental health issues, a lot of that will come down to the misinterpretation of the faith, imposing that on women, not allowing them to grow and flourish and develop, and then actually sort of in a way holding back half of our community. I've mentioned before, at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, we know that all of the masajid that he built had space for women to pray. We have a situation in the UK where there are people who there are places where women are not even allowed into the place and be part of it. And it's really ironic. Certainly I've been sort of reminded or taught that the actual mimbar in the masjid, which is where the imam stands and is actually raised so that people can see him, came originally from a request from a woman who mentioned that she couldn't actually see him from where she was, and so he needed to be raised up. And we know quite stories of people like Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, who was questioned by a woman in public about something, and he had to resign himself to the fact that she was right and he was wrong. And when I think about those stories and hear those examples, I actually don't recognise that in the situation I have in my own community in 2013 in Britain, unfortunately. So there are issues, but I think it's generally very positive. So I think in summary, I would say that the Muslim women in Britain have had an interesting journey, and we are moving in the right direction. There are a lot more women who are are educated. The Muslim girls' achievements in education actually are more than the boys in many of the age groups, and where that's encouraged, it's working very, very well. I think Muslim women, as any women, have a really important role to play in society, and I think because the image of Islam is often seen as negative purely because of women, we then have an extra role to play to try and redress some of that balance. And we can't do that living in isolation, living in our own ghettos. We need to be friends, we need to have relationships with people from all backgrounds to really try and break down and show them that we are proud of who we are, but we are also like them as well. A strong sort of family role for women and Muslim women, clearly we have that as part of our teachings, and it's encouraged. Education, putting a lot of emphasis on that, and we really have in this country, so much opportunity that there's no excuse for people not developing themselves personally, not giving the best chance of education to their children, and really sort of seeing ourselves as a community that needs to raise our bar to the point that we know the Prophet was, peace be upon him, was very particular about having, you know, developing things with excellence, and often I don't really feel that we put enough emphasis on that. And I think we, you know, there's no conflict. There's no conflict with being a happy, settled Muslim woman in Britain, whether you be working or home based or studying or doing all of those things at the same time. It's encouraged. It's supported. And if you can develop a relationship in your home life and with friends, good people around you, develop those kind of relationships where people encourage you, push you forward, help you to develop yourself. I think, you know, the everything is looking very, very positive. And in that sense, it's one of the, I think, the best countries, the sort of freest countries in the world. People often ask me questions like, would Britain ever ban the headscarf, for example? And I absolutely categorically say no, it wouldn't. And the reason I can say that clearly is because we have a very different environment here to maybe in France or in other European countries. There's a lot of good relationships, a lot of good work that's happened over the years, a lot of positive work that happens between faiths, and that's really something that we need to keep working at and do as much of that as we can. But actually, even now, I can see the benefits of that and some of the amazing women, female Muslim role models that are coming out of Britain, that I think it really does encourage me. And if we can continue in that way, we're going to see some of the best examples of, you know, female role models and leaders in this country in all spheres, not just in Muslim communities, not just in Muslim dealing with Muslim issues, but everywhere in academia, in all of the professions, as MPs, as you know, in Parliament. So I think for me, there's negatives. I always recognise those and talk about those and have a reputation for highlighting the issues within our own communities, but also to really acknowledge that actually there's a lot of positive as well. And with that, I will end, and inshallah see you on another session. Assalamu alaikum.